You had spoken before about some interesting things that were discovered by Catherine Casey at the Carnegie Endowment. Can you tell us that story, please?
Yes, I'm glad to, Mr. Griffin. This experience that you have just referred to came about in response to a letter which I had written to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, asking certain questions and gathering certain information. And on the arrival of that letter, Dr. Johnson, who was then president of the Carnegie Endowment, telephoned me and said, did I ever come up to New York? And I said, yes, I did, more or less each weekend. And he said, well, when you're next here, will you drop in and see us? Which I did. And again, on arrival at the office of the endowment, I found myself in the presence of Dr. Joseph Johnson, the president, who was a successor to Alger Hiss, two vice presidents, and their own counsel, a partner in the firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. And Dr. Johnson said, after, again, amenities, Mr. Dodd, we have your letter. We can answer all those questions, but it'd be a great deal of trouble. And we have a counter-suggestion. And our counter-suggestion is that if you can spare a member of your staff for 2 weeks and send that member up to New York, we will give to that member a room in the library and the minute books of this foundation since its inception. And we think that whatever you want to find out, or the Congress wants to find out, will be obvious from those minutes. Well, my first reaction was they'd lost their mind. I had a pretty good idea of what those minutes would contain, but I realized that Dr. Johnson had only been in office 2 years, and the vice presidents were relatively young men, and counsel seemed to be also a young man, and I guessed that probably they'd never read the minutes themselves. And so I said I had somebody, I would take it. I would accept their offer, and I went back to Washington, and I selected the member of my staff who was on my staff, having been a practicing attorney in Washington, but she was on my staff to see to it that I didn't break any congressional procedures or rules. In addition to which, she was unsympathetic to the purpose of the investigation. She was level-headed and a very reasonably brilliant, capable lady. And her attitude toward the investigation was, what could possibly be wrong with foundations? They do so much good. Well, in the face of that sincere conviction of Catherine's, I went out of my way not to prejudice her in any way. But I did explain to her that she couldn't possibly cover 50 years of handwritten minutes in 2 weeks. So she would have to do what we call spot reading. And I blocked out certain periods of time to concentrate on. And off she went to New York. She came back at the end of 2 weeks with the following in the way of, on dictaphone belts. We are now at the year 1908, which was the year that the Carnegie began operations. And in that year, the trustees, meeting for the first time, raised a specific question, which they discussed throughout the balance of the year in a very learned fashion. And the question is there any means known more effective than war, assuming you wish to alter the life of an entire people? And they conclude that no more effective means than war to that end is known to humanity. So then in 1909 they raised the second question and discussed it, namely, how do we involve the United States in a war? Well, I doubt at that time if there was any subject more removed from the thinking of most of the people of this country than its involvement in a war. There were intermittent shows in the Balkans, but I doubt very much if many people even knew where the Balkans was. Then finally, they answer that question as follows. We must control the State Department. And then that very naturally raises the question of how do we do that? And they answer it by saying, we must take over and control the diplomatic machinery of this country. And finally, they resolve to aim at that as an objective. Then time passes, and we are eventually in a war, which would have been World War I. And at that time, they record on their minutes a shocking report in which they dispatched to President Wilson a telegram cautioning him to see that the war does not end too quickly. And finally, of course, the war is over. At that time, their interest shifts over to preventing what they call a reversion of life in the United States to what it was prior to 1914, when World War I broke out. And they arrive at that point, they come to the conclusion that to prevent a reversion, we must control education in the United States. And they realize that that's a pretty big task. So to them, it is too big for them alone, so they approach the Rockefeller Foundation with the suggestion that that portion of education which could be considered domestic be handled by the Rockefeller Foundation, and that portion which is international should be handled by the endowment. And they then decide that the key to the success of these two operations lay in an alteration in the teaching of American history. So they approach 4 of the then most prominent teachers of American history in the country, people like Charles and Mary Bird, and their suggestion to them is, will they alter the manner in which they present this subject, and they get turned down flat. So they then decide that it is necessary for them to do, as they say, build our own stable of historians. And then they approach the Guggenheim Foundation, which specializes in fellowships, and say, when we find young men in the process of studying for doctorates in the field of American history, and we feel that they are the right caliber, will you grant them fellowships on our say-so? And the answer is yes. So under that condition, eventually they assemble 20. And they take this 20 potential teachers of American history to London, and there they're briefed into what is expected of them when, as and if they secure appointments in keeping with the doctorates they will have earned. And that group of 20 historians ultimately becomes the nucleus of the American Historical Association. And then toward the end of the 1920s, the endowment grants to the American Historical Association $400,000 for a study of our history in a manner which points to what can this country can it look forward to in the future. And that culminates in a 7-volume study, the last volume of which is, of course, in essence, a summary of the contents of the other 6. And the essence of the last volume is the future of this country belongs to collectivism administered with characteristic American efficiency. That's the story that ultimately grew out of, and of course was what could have been presented by the members of this congressional committee to the Congress as a whole for just exactly what it said. But they never got to that point.
This is the story that emerged from the minutes of the Carnegie Fund.
That's right.
Carnegie Endowment
That's
Fund.
right.
And so...
It was official to that extent.
I see. And Catherine Casey brought all of these back in the form of dictated notes or verbatim readings of the minutes.
On dictaphone belts.
Are those in existence today?
I don't know. But if they are, they're somewhere in the archives under the control of the Congress, House of Representatives.
Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
We have with us 6 from the Afghanistan freedom fighters.
Member for a long time and was actually a director for some period of time. I never mentioned that when I was campaigning for re-election back home in Wyoming.
I intend to keep this promise. If you like your doctor, you'll be able to keep your doctor. If you like your health care plan, you'll be able to keep your health care plan.
Years ahead, Libya could become a peaceful democracy, or it could face protracted civil war, or it could descend into chaos. Gaddafi should put the well-being and the interests of his own people first and help facilitate a democratic transition that will meet the aspirations of the Libyan people.
I don't believe that anybody is above the law. On the other hand, I also have a belief that we need to look forward as opposed to looking backwards.
We're all clear that any referendum vote in Crimea this week will be illegal, illegitimate, and will not be recognised by the international community.
I'm just telling the truth now. I don't have to run for office again, so I can just, let it rip.
"100 years ago, in 1913, the Fed was created, and we've marked it with a vertical line there. Consumer prices now are about 30 times higher than they were when the Fed was created in 1913.
Paper money, too, is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve. Hence the dollars in circulation are not Treasury notes, not bills of credit, but Federal Reserve notes, debt-based notes backed up ultimately, by the government's own promise to pay, its sovereign bonds backed up by the taxpayers themselves. At one time, the Federal Reserve banks were legally required to keep large stockpiles of gold in reserve to back up these notes. But that requirement was abandoned, and today the notes are backed up mostly by government securities. The Fed no longer keeps any actual gold on its books, but gold certificates issued by the Treasury and valued not at the spot price of $1,300 per troy ounce, but an arbitrarily fixed statutory price of $42 2/9 per ounce.
But I do have one question. During the crisis, or any time that you're aware of, has the Federal Reserve or Treasury participated in any gold swaps arrangements?
We don't. The Federal Reserve does not own any gold at all. We have not owned gold since 1934. So we have not engaged in any gold swaps.
But it appears on your balance sheet that you hold gold.
What appears on our balance sheet is gold certificates. When we turned before 1934, the Federal Reserve did own gold. We turned that over by law to the Treasury and received in return for that gold certificates.
If the Treasury entered into, because under the Exchange Stabilization Fund, I would assume they probably have the legal authority to do it, they wouldn't be able to do it then because you have the securities for essentially all the gold?
No, we have no interest in the gold that is owned by the Treasury. We have simply an accounting document that is called gold certificates that represents the value at a statutory rate
and still
that we gave to the Treasury in 1930.
And still measured at $42 an ounce, which makes no sense whatsoever.
Clearly, there is a discrepancy between what we are led to believe is motivating the Fed and what it actually does. To understand what the Fed is actually intended to do, it's first important to understand that the Federal Reserve is not a bank per se, but a system. This system codifies, institutionalizes, oversees, and undergirds a form of banking called fractional reserve banking, in which banks are allowed to lend out more money than they actually have in their vaults.
The whole process starts, the process of decay and corruption starts with something called fractional reserve banking. That's the technical name for it. And what that really means is that as the banking institution developed over several centuries, starting, of course, in Europe, it developed the practice of legalizing a certain dishonest accounting procedure. In other words, in the very, very beginning, if you want to go all the way back, people would bring their gold or silver to the banks for safekeeping. And they'd say, give us a paper receipt. And we don't want to guard our silver and our gold because, people could come in the middle of the night and they could kill us or tie us up and threaten us, and they'll get our gold and silver, so we can't really guard it. We'll take it to the bank and have them guard it, and we just want a paper receipt so that we can take the receipt back and get our gold anytime we want. And so in the beginning, money was receipt money. They could then, instead of changing or exchanging the gold coins, they could exchange the receipts. And people would accept the receipts just as well as the gold, knowing they could get the gold. And so these paper receipts being circulated were, in essence, the very first examples of paper money. Well, the banks learned early on that game that here they were sitting on this pile of gold and all these paper receipts out there. People weren't bringing the receipts in anymore. Very few of them, maybe 5%, maybe 7% of the people would bring in their paper receipts and ask for the gold. So they said, why don't we just sort of give more receipts out than we have gold? They'll never know because we only are asked at the best 7% of it, so we can create more receipts for gold than we have, and we can collect interest on that because we'll loan that into the economy and we'll charge interest on this money that we don't really have. And it's a pretty good gimmick, don't you think? And well, yeah, of course. And so that's how fractional reserve banking started. And now it's institutionalized, and they teach it in school. No one ever questions the integrity of it or the ethics of it. They say, well, that's the way banking works. And isn't it wonderful that we now have this flexible currency and we have prosperity and all of this sort of thing? So it all starts with this concept of fractional reserve banking. And the trouble is with that is it works most of the time, but every once in a while, these there are a few ripples that come along that are a little bit bigger than the other ripples, and maybe one of them is a wave, and more than 7% will come in and ask for their gold. Maybe 20% will come in, or 30%. And well, now the banks are embarrassed because the fraud is exposed. They say, well, we don't have your gold. What do you mean you don't have my gold? I gave it to you and put it on deposit, and you said you'd safeguard it. Well, we don't have it. We loaned it out. So then the word gets out, and everybody and their uncle comes and lines up for their gold. And of course, they don't have it, and the banks are closed. They have bank holidays, and the banks are embarrassed. They go out of business. People lose their savings, and you have these terrible banking crashes that were ricocheting all around the world prior to this time. And that's what caused the concern. One of the things that caused the concern of the American people. They didn't want that anymore. They wanted to put a stop to that. And that was the whole purpose, supposedly, of the Federal Reserve System, was to put a stop to that. But since the people who designed the plan to put a stop to it were the very ones who were doing it in the first place, you can not be surprised that their solution was not a very good one insofar as the American people were concerned. Their solution was to expand it. Not to control it, but to expand it. See, prior to that time, this little game of fractional reserve banking was localized at the state level. Each state was doing its own little fractional reserve banking system. Each state, in essence, had its own Federal Reserve. Central banks were authorized by state law to do this sort of thing, and that was causing all this problem. And so the Federal Reserve came along and said, well, no, we're not going to do this at the state level anymore because look at all the problem it's causing. We're going to consolidate it all together, and we're going to do it at the national level.
So the story goes on, the biggest scam in the world, the bankers charging debt-based slavery interest out of thin air by usury Federal Reserve notes. It's the biggest scam the world has ever seen. It's worse than 9/11 and all the false flags in the last 2 centuries combined. It's deadlier than all of that. It's really the biggest lie. And where is this leading us? How can we resist? How can we overcome?
Well, first of all, global warfare is now being waged in all major regions of the world in various forms. In some cases, it's theater wars, as in Yemen. In Syria and Iraq, it's a US-sponsored insurgency, the so-called Islamic State. In Latin America, it's a process of destabilization of national economies, but also militarization, the sending in of Marines to Central America. In Southeast Asia and the Far East, it's the so-called pivot to Asia. It's a situation of provocation, largely directed against China. In Ukraine, on Russia's border, it's acts of provocation directed against the Russian Federation and the conquest, essentially, of new frontiers for the global economy. In Africa, it's US-sponsored insurgencies, the destabilization of national economies, the battle for oil. And largely, we're dealing with very powerful corporate actors which control and overshadow the governments. If we wish to give it some kind of structure, we're talking about, of course, the oil companies, the big oil, the Anglo-American oil companies, Wall Street, of course, which is involved in financial destabilization, what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, which are the large defense contractors, the mercenary companies, the intelligence and security corporate apparatus, linked, of course, to the U.S. military and to NATO. And then, of course, you have the media conglomerates, which are there serving the process of war propaganda, upholding a corporate agenda. And then you also have, and that's very important, you have the biotech conglomerates, big pharma. One dimension of this global war is the destruction and demise of the agricultural cycle, the fact that when you introduce genetically modified seeds into a region such as sub-Saharan Africa, you not only destroy agriculture, but you destroy biodiversity, and you undermine the livelihood of an entire region. And that's happening in countries like India. It's happening throughout sub-Saharan Africa, and it is part of that global agenda. The global warfare is not limited to military interventions. It uses covert operations. It also is geared towards destabilizing sovereign governments through so-called colored revolutions, the installation of proxy regimes which will obey orders, and so on and so forth. It's a very complex process, and we have to connect, in a sense, all the different dimensions of this devastating process, which is destroying countries, transforming sovereign nations into territories, open space for corporations, impoverishing the world population. And that impoverishment is not the consequence of a scarcity of resources. It is the result of manipulation and destruction of economic and social structures and institutions.
Well, you paint a very vivid and concise picture of the total carnage and warfare that is encircling the globe in a number of different aspects, and you, I think, rightly identify it as part of the corporate government collusion, the fascistic collusion, which is at the heart of this empire of chaos that is reigning around the globe. I guess the obvious question then is, what is the next stage of this global warfare? Does it develop into hot warfare in the traditional sense, or will it remain on an economic covert operations level?
Well, I think that, in a sense, the military planners have all options on the table, so to speak, to quote Hillary Clinton. They are involved in covert operations and regime change, the destabilization of national economies, economic sanctions, but they are also contemplating the use of high-tech weapon systems, of course, including nuclear war. And I say nuclear war is not only targeted towards, let's say, Russia and China, using the arsenal of the Cold War era, in other words, the thermonuclear weapons, but it is also directed against non-nuclear states using the so-called tactical nuclear weapons. But then there are other systems, there are other areas of intervention. We know that the U.S. Air Force has command over environmental, what is called environmental modification techniques, or weather warfare. It's a controversial subject, but it's fairly well documented that the U.S. military can modify the weather and trigger environmental catastrophes. And they even use the term, and I quote, owning the weather for military use. And then you have other areas of intervention. You have biological warfare, chemical warfare. You have, of course, there's the whole area of cyber warfare, the destabilization of countries' communication systems, and so on. We're in the realm of high-tech communications. And then another area, of course, of warfare is propaganda. It's turning realities upside down. It's presenting America as the protagonist of democracy and inciting people to endorse a so-called anti-terrorist agenda when it is known and documented that these terrorist organizations, including Al-Qaeda and more recently ISIS, the Islamic State, are creatures of U.S. intelligence. And so that we are now in a situation where we support a global war on terrorism, including sectors of the progressive left, who say, well, we're against war, but we support the war on terrorism. It's a non sequitur. And within Western countries, there's also an internal war which is ongoing, which is the war of the governments and the corporations against their citizens, namely through the anti-terrorist legislation, where you can arrest people without any, just on suspicion, on alleged, because they're alleged terrorists and so on. And that trend now is evolving towards a situation of police state environment, which affects, of course, the fundamental rights of citizens. And that's happening in many countries in the West. And then with regard to the war within Western countries, you have the imposition of these deadly austerity measures. We see the situation in Greece, but it's not only in Greece, it's in countries like Spain, Italy, not to mention Iceland a few years back. And that, in a sense, is a form of internal warfare. It's based on debt conditionalities. It's the imposition of deadly macroeconomic reforms, something which has been applied in third world countries from the beginning of the 1980s, but which is now being applied in most Western countries, leading to the demise of social programs, the destruction of employment, the creation of mass unemployment, the removal of all social safety nets, and ultimately we're evolving, and I think both at the national and global level, we're evolving from a situation of poverty to despair. People, particularly if we take countries like India, where we see a whole range of suicides in the rural areas, which are largely attributable to the crisis of agriculture and the imposition of genetically modified seeds, where people commit suicide. In Africa, we see humanitarian disasters which are beyond, so to speak, they're beyond poverty. We're not dealing with global poverty, which was something which I researched in the 1990s. We're dealing with despair, with the destruction of livelihood, the destruction of family life. The deaths resulting from warfare, but also the deaths resulting from a process of engineered destruction of economic activity, and where poor people have no longer the right to be poor. They're marginalized and excluded. And simultaneously, we're looking at the realm of economics, we see the emergence of this upper-end luxury goods economy, which is geared towards a small segment of the population. So there's increased polarization, social polarization taking place everywhere. You won't see, if you're traveling in Southeast Asia, you won't see the poor people. You'll see avenues of hotels and condominiums and so on. So that, in a sense, what's happening is a restructuring of the fabric of national societies, where the hope of actually acceding to the status of an employee or a worker within a factory may be a dream for many people who are simply marginalized. And that is a situation even happening in countries like Spain and Greece, where, up to 40% of the labor force are unemployed.
Well, in fact, we see very much that war on the poorest of the poor, even in the heart of the empire itself, with many cities trying to even make feeding the homeless a crime of sorts in the United States. So we see this being waged, and more aggressively so. I guess then, can we see any countervailing tendencies towards this globalization of war?
Well, they are of course, some very significant developments. If we look at the situation, let's say in Greece or in Spain, where seemingly progressive governments have emerged. But I should caution in that regard, because these seemingly progressive governments are often hijacked by corporate foundations which are funding them. It's the same thing with regard to NGOs. And they ultimately are caving in to the demands of the creditors and the large financial institutions. I think what has happened in the course of the last 20 or 30 years is that the whole fabric of particularly Western society, where you had trade unions, you had civil society organizations, which were in fact, and you had governments which were putting forth a progressive, a social democratic agenda. This scenario, or this landscape has been totally modified. The resistance to this corporate agenda, and we're talking about global capitalism, is no longer there. It's no longer there. It's fragmented. It's co-opted. The trade union leaders go to Davos and mingle with the corporations, the corporate leaders, so that through the process of co-optation, we see a fragmentation of civil society into different areas. Environmentalists on the one hand, anti-war on the other, women's rights, and ultimately emerging from that is a mosaic of resistance rather than an organized structure which will challenge this project. And again, we're dealing with a military agenda. We're dealing with an economic agenda which is supported by the military agenda. We're dealing with a process of destabilization of livelihood, so to speak. It's the reproduction of real life which is at stake. And I think what is extremely dangerous in this situation is that those who decide, particularly with regard to the use of so-called, what we might describe as weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons, they believe their own propaganda. And there's a whole current within the US military, we're talking about nuclear doctrine, to the effect that nuclear weapons are, quote, harmless to the surrounding civilian population. And that refers to the tactical nuclear weapons, the mini nukes. And there are other areas there are other areas where propaganda seems to take over the people who decide. And sometimes those people mean well, but they think that by doing certain things, they're going to improve the livelihood of the world population. And so that when decision makers believe in the use of nuclear weapons as a means to bring peace to the world, we're in a very, very dangerous situation. And having consulted military documents, I can say that this is true, is that they say, well, we have to use war as a peacemaking undertaking, as a means to instill democracy. And they also say that nuclear weapons might be the avenue, okay, or certain type of nuclear weapons. And I should warn people, although this is a very complex subject, is that back in 2002, the US Senate cleared the use of tactical nuclear weapons to be used in the conventional war theater, and that the whole notion that the commander-in-chief, namely the President of the United States, would actually give the green light, that has been scrapped. These tactical nuclear weapons are part of what they call the military toolbox. They can be used even by a 3-star general in the region or in the war region, and they're part of the arsenal of conventional warfare. Now, all those things, all those dimensions, the economic, the social, the military dimensions, coalesce and are sustained by an extensive apparatus of media propaganda. I'm referring to the mainstream media, the corporate media, which sustains the lies and ultimately controls what people think. And this, I would say, is an inquisitorial environment. It's much more devastating than the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition was also based on a big lie, and it lasted for 300 or 400 years. But we are dealing with a media apparatus which turns realities upside down, presents the Western quest and military adventure as a peacemaking undertaking, which lies with regard to the casualties of war, which presents the war criminals as protagonists of human rights, and so on and so forth. And that in itself is the pinnacle of this system. It really, without the mainstream media and war propaganda, this New World Order agenda doesn't have a leg to stand on. And in other words, without these media lies, the military agenda, the economic agenda would collapse like a deck of cards. But and that is why it is absolutely fundamental that within the realm of independent media and alternative media, we wage a war against the mainstream media. In other words, it's a war of ideas. It is an obligation on our part to support the truth and to use truth as a means, as a weapon to undermine the legitimacy of this global economic and military agenda, which is destroying humanity. It is global war, it is total war, and it is destruction. And it has a logic, and it's part of global capitalism. But at this stage, it is not a struggle against socialism, but it is a struggle against national capitalism. In other words, it's the global capitalist elites, mainly Anglo-American, dominated by Wall Street and City of London, the large financial centers, against competing capitalist powers, which we might name them Russia, China. China's not a communist country. China is a capitalist country, in fact, a very advanced capitalist country, and so is Iran. And so that essentially what this war involves is world domination. It's the establishment of a global economic and political system whereby countries worldwide would be subordinated to these global corporations, and where national sovereignty under national capitalism would be undermined. And the trade and investment agreements which are being negotiated behind closed doors are part of this agenda. They're part of this agenda, and in effect they are the end game of this agenda, whereby global corporations undermine and destroy national and regional corporations, in other words, bankruptcy of the entire landscape, and impose a global economic agenda throughout the world.
For more on this story and other breaking news and current events, please go to globalresearch.ca. For more research and analysis by James Corbett, please go to corbettreport.com.